I am a research assistant with Dr. Salsabil Al-Mansouri's Technology Facilitated Sexual Violence in Ontario Secondary Schools project as part of the Faculty of Education here in the University of Windsor. So, first, just a little intro. Can you please, briefly introduce yourself and your academic background, please?
Yeah, so my name is Noha Beydoun. I teach at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. My PhD is in English Literary and Cultural Studies, and my body of research focuses on U.S. imperialism through the vantage point of representations of hijab, self-narratives of hijab.
Awesome. So I want to definitely take a dive into the article, the piece that you wrote.
Mhm.
So first, what inspired you to research and write about hijabi girlhoods for the special issue?
Well, the editors had reached out to me about the special issue, and when I looked into it, and obviously we aligned, and I was actually really excited for the opportunity because my body of research focuses on understanding U.S. imperialism through the vantage point of hijab. And as we know, the personal practice has been like highly politicized in US culture through the language of like freedom and unfreedom. This is the what I mostly focus on in the larger body of work from which this article emerges. And so like what I had noticed is that most conversations of Muslim girlhood or hijab focuses or like talks about Muslim women through the lens of representational politics, for example, subverting stereotypes or pushing back against popular narratives. But I wanted to contribute with a new framework or approach that allows us to question the constructs or narratives that shape these like perceptions to reveal how our inadvertent investment in them can actually be harmful. And so ultimately, like, I write this article talking about like donning the physical hijab as the American flag and how this is harmful. But in general, like part of my research is like actually moving us past representational politics so that towards a more historical or socio-political or examining like economic structures to reveal deep-rooted like histories that wouldn't otherwise be revealed through representational politics. And so we can actually see how these dynamics take shape and can actually be harmful.
Yeah, you spoke a lot about like donning the American hijab and how it was kind of on the one hand, trying to show how Muslim women in the United States felt that they had the right to practice their religion freely. But at the same time, it was a double-edged sword because it imposed America's imperialistic interests and policies
Mhm.
on them, where it subjugates them to, you're a good Muslim only if you believe in American values.
Mhm.
And if you don't or differ on them, you're looked at as a bad Muslim.
Yeah.
So can you summarize the key findings or arguments of your article?
Yeah. So I was interested in, I thought it was totally befitting to contribute with this specific article because like we're talking about hijabi girlhood studies, and then there was this phenomenon during like the recent protests that I described in the article where Muslim women in response to like the political art campaigns by Shepard Fairey and prior to that a few other instances where Muslim women had donned the American flag as hijab, and media reception was that this was a really brave act of resistance and it was very courageous. And we saw many Muslim women subsequently adapting this practice during protests, like you said, in response to like the threat of not being able to practice their religion freely. But what I found was that what was seemingly a brave, and hijab is very personal, right? And so, you know, as these women intended to demonstrate, number one, their American values, number two, their right to practice freely in the United States, freedom of religion, their, you know, right to belong too within the United States, like it was actually reinforcing the very harm that they protested against. But again, through a framework where we look at the history of the flag itself and the ways in which it's been used to like mask harmful, violent colonial or U.S. imperial practices, only through a deep dive in history do we actually see that this is harmful and it perpetuates the very thing or reinforces the very like the very ideas and principles that these women are protesting against. Or it
Yeah.
masks this deep rooted history. It kind of erases this history in which violence has taken shape, or the flag has been used to mask the violence that's been taken shape during these historical moments. And when you see the flag on a Muslim woman's body or on her head, it's almost like a complete erasure of this
Mm,
complicated history.
yeah. Um, so moving on, what
Mhm.
do you think, or what was the most surprising or challenging part, or challenging aspect of your research on hijabi girlhoods?
Yeah, so this is a great question because hijab is a very personal practice for every woman, and even like during these protests, hijab, this act meant so many different things to so many different women. And so the challenge comes in the fact that I always want to clarify that I'm not a religious scholar interested in telling women how they should or shouldn't practice, nor am I in any way suggesting that Muslim women are aware or somehow like doing that, like aware of these dynamics, right? It's actually like quite the opposite. It's an inadvertent investment in like identity politics, for example. It's an inadvertent investment that or it's revealed that US government bleeds into the way that we understand ourselves, such that marginalized groups are conditioned to invest in their own subjugation, right? But we don't know that we're doing this, nor am I trying to tell Muslim women how to practice, but I'm having a very scholarly conversation about the politicization of hijab in American culture. Does that make sense? And so, like,
Yeah.
achieving this nuance, like, is challenging and it requires careful and deliberate articulation. And, you know, again, like, when we situate like what we think is protest, like for example the conversations of hijab around freedom or unfreedom, when we say like, oh, hijab is oppressive, and then we say no, it's free, or it's hijab is unfree, whatever, it's two sides of the same coin. And when we situate hijab through this lens, we there's an inadvertent investment in neoliberal language that shapes US government policy. So we're peddling it, but I never want the conversation to be mistaken for me telling women how to practice or blaming Muslim women for the way this phenomenon works. In fact, we don't know that it is. We are conditioned uh, to protest or to resist through this language.
Yeah. Sometimes like even through many means, through media or government policies, people end up doing something which they think is good, but in the background, it actually harms them in
Yeah,
some sh way, shape, or form.
right.
Which leads me to my next question regarding the impact of your piece. How do you think that your research contributes to the broader understanding of hijabi girlhoods?
So I go back and I say like it reveals the problems with identity politics and our framework of representations of representational politics when it comes to Muslim women in the media. I think, of course, like representational politics is, I mean, representational examinations, it's important. Representation, of course, is important. We're not going to dismiss it. But what I am saying is that we need to look deeper towards the historical or the socio-political or the economic constructs that shape our understanding, or create the narratives within which we feel we must push back against. I think that's far more revealing um, to the ways in which, for example, US imperialism takes shape and reproduces itself, and that these are deliberate constructs in service to the nation rather than, they're representing me this way and this is how I'm going to challenge this representation. So I would say that it reveals the problems with identity politics, or the ways in which US government policy again bleeds into the way marginalized groups on a broader level um, are conditioned to invest in their own subjugation. So like hijab is like a case study, I would say, towards towards this understanding of this conditioning. It's an example by which we can understand how these dynamics take shape.
Perfect. What impact do you hope your work will have on future research or education or policy of some kind?
I think that like the impact would, I mean, US imperialism, it's big. I hope that we can create a sense of awareness. I hope that, you know, through this understanding, you know, we can start to see the ways in which US imperialism takes shape first within the United States to construct a narrative that justifies practices abroad, but also the ways in which we are complacent to these practices inadvertently, of course, unconsciously almost. And, I hope it allows us to understand the ways in which all marginalized groups are impacted by systems of oppression. And that will in turn inform our policy for like with a greater sense of awareness.
Perfect. That was a great answer.
Thank you.
No problem. Moving on to the current relevance, are there any recent developments or events in your opinion that you believe have made your research even more relevant today?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we see a deteriorating state of the human condition across, many different parts of the world right now with war and conflict. And I would also say the recent conversations specifically on hijab, the global conversations that were happening on hijab, like with hijab, with regard to, resistance or uh, like force with Iran. I think that the ways in which they were shaped, constructed, narrated to the US, or our response to, grant freedom again through, intervention or aid, I think there is a conversation to be had about these. But I also think, like I said, the broader implications and how um, policy bleeds into the way we understand ourselves and how it directly impacts, you know, government policy overseas is deeply relevant to today, especially in the larger body of work within which this emerges, on
Yeah.
hijab and its connection to US imperialism.
Yeah, it's definitely that
Definitely.
strong link,
Yeah.
yeah, of hijab and how its role plays with US imperialism, both at home and across the globe.
Yeah, so it's totally necessary to create this understanding within the United States, or create this narrative within the United States that we all then invest in, like the narrative of freedom. It becomes like this ubiquitous term. We don't really know what it means, but we all invest in the idea of freedom, which is so important and common sense. Like David Harvey says in a brief history of neoliberalism, but it becomes like this ubiquitous common sense term that none of us would really be against, but at the same time, like what this freedom looks like in different parts of the world. It
Yes,
necessarily, we peddle our complacency, peddles it.
for sure. That's like the best way you could have put it. Freedom is obviously in a way a universal term,
Yeah.
but it definitely looks different
Yes.
to people depending on where you live and how you live in different
Yeah.
types, in different parts of the world.
Yeah. So to go back to your question, I wouldn't say that the American flag hijab itself with this article is the thing that's like, I think the broader implications of this research about how you can invest in ideologies that are actually harmful or actually constructed by neoliberal ideas, for example. I think the bigger body of work that points towards, the language that we've absorbed to protest and the ways in which these narratives take shape and reproduce themselves in the context of the human condition right now, or this the global state of affairs, U.S. government um, policy overseas, or whatever it is. I think that that's more relevant than ever.
For sure. Uh, Final thoughts. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about your research and the importance of this topic?
um I think that I've said a mouthful. I think that it's one perspective. You don't have to agree. It is, a carefully nuanced perspective that I think, really just, begs the question. Like what I had noticed was we always have to talk about, if we're talking about Muslim women, we always have to talk about hijab. And if we're talking about hijab, most of the time we're talking about it in the context of freedom. So I just, this, this body of research is really to ask the question of like whether, if we're talking about freedom, what does freedom actually look like in in U.S. government? Like what what are the constructs that shape our understanding of freedom? And then of course we see the values of freedom, that the flag invokes as superimposed on, the head of a Muslim woman. What are we then doing? So, what are the broader implications of that? But I would say I think that this is just one perspective, one understanding that urges us to move past representational politics to more towards more of a comprehensive understanding that looks at the history and economic structures that shape representation.
Amazing. Last question. How can people stay engaged with your work or any similar studies that you have going on?
I'm happy to connect. My body of work is out there. It's still in baby form, but it's moving towards publication, speaking engagements. But I'm really happy to connect and stay part of the conversation. Whether that's in published work or that's in like conversations like this that give people access to important things that are happening.
Perfect. Well, I'd like to thank you for giving me the time to
Of
sit
course,
down with you. I don't like to call it an interview. I like to think of it more as a
a
sit down because
conversation.
we're kind
Yeah,
of, yeah, having a conversation. So,
yeah.
Dr. Noha Beydoun, I appreciate you giving me the time for that.
Thank you guys for having me, and thank you
Thank
for
you very much.
engaging with me. I appreciate it.